Right, well tonight we have a very prominent person in the person of Dr. John Daly. Most of you will know something of Dr. Daly. He's a professor at the University of South Australia and a lecturer in history and sociology in sport. He's a member of the Association of Professional Historians and the author of some, I think, about 5 or 6 books. And he has had a particular interest in all fields of sport. He has been coach of the Australian athletics team at the Olympic Games and a prominent coach of such great athletes such as Glenn is none. So he's well qualified. His talk tonight is entitled FEMINAE LUDENS, Women in Sport in South Australia. So I'll ask Dr. Daly to address us.
I've put together a number of slides of women playing sport in South Australia, and they may provide some amusement for you, and some of you in fact may be able to add some even more interesting stories than I possibly could about that particular era. When I first came in, Barbara Biggins, who I knew as Barbara Lane, was reminding me about the fact that when I was competing in athletes with her, I had a change room and that she in fact didn't. I guess we never knew those kinds of things, but she can perhaps add some colour to this at the end. But what I'd like to do is to take it from a particular point of view, and I won't explain the point of view, you'll see where I'm going hopefully as I go. Sport in Australia is often described as the theatre of the masses, but it's male theatre. Sure, women play sport, and some play it very well, but it's still deemed predominantly a men's activity. You don't believe me? Well, perhaps the women would, but perhaps the men might not. Analysis of media reporting in this country, confirms what I'm saying, that the press and television describe male sport in preference to women's. Over the last decade, so not in the old days, but over the last decade, media coverage of women's sport in Australia has increased 4-fold. That sounds pretty good. But given its starting point at only 2.5% in 1988, the 13.8% reported in the 1996 research shouldn't excite too many women or worry too many men. Women's sports stories continue to be poorly located in inner pages or lower columns or ignored altogether. The sporting magazines need little comment. There are now a few dedicated women's sports journals, but the mainstream journals like this one, which the students at the university keep telling me is in fact some of them try writing their papers from this, tell me is the journal. I'm yet to find a good article in it, but they tell me it's the good journal. Magazines like this, Inside Sport, continue to be predominantly about men's sport and to portray women, I think, in a questionable way. And I think it's put onto the cover, but also for the image. Television, made as it is for the moving image, the colour and the spectacle that is contemporary sport, highlights the discrimination against women in sport. Coverage of women's sport attracted 1.3% in 1988 and 2% in 1996. Given the importance of the medium, the silence in regard to women's sport on TV continues to annoy those women and some men who would argue that sport is still a site of gender discrimination and inequity in Australia. And I love this little cartoon because it reminds me of me noting the sporting results on the weekend and my wife saying, weren't the women playing this weekend? And she's quite right, because there's very little women's sport reported. Murray Phillips at the University of South Australia, a colleague of mine, the researcher who provided these figures, concluded in his report to the federal government that the very poor representation of women's sport on TV has, and I quote, made it very difficult for women to gain credibility or project suitable role models for others to emulate. Photographic images, when they do appear in newspapers or magazines, continue to reinforce gender discrimination in sport. Women are usually depicted as inactive models of the bimbo type, and there are certain women who in fact are not shown in illustrations for fairly obvious reasons. I mean, where are the disabled women in sport? But these inactive models. In the written text, they're stereotyped by their physical traits, by their clothes, their emotions and their relationships. And if you need any sort of memory lane stuff, I'll just remind you that those of you who watched the Commonwealth Games last year will remember the Australian girl Heather Turland, who won the marathon, and she did very, very well, but it was very much about the fact that she was the mum of a group of boys and how she fitted it into her family and so on. But it was all about her personal relationships rather than about the fact that she was an outstanding marathon runner. Men, on the other hand, are described in agonistic terms. It's a technical term, agon, Greek word for contest. But in agonistic terms, we hear about their courage, their aggression and their toughness, with little or no comment about factors other than those related to their sporting talent. The reason for this, I don't think, is hard to fathom. Sport is still viewed as a male activity. It is used to define gender, male gender. Young boys in our society are encouraged to play sport because, and I quote, because it is still used, they say, sport will make a man of you. As I say to the phys ed students, both men and women at the university, if sport makes a man of you, what does it do for women? And of course that becomes then quite contentious and a good debate. But even if little boys don't play sport, they're made to feel somehow inadequate if they don't participate in sport. They haven't made that breach to sort of being somehow male. Conversely, I'd point out, if sport defines masculinity, it can only do so if it's the preserve of men and women are excluded or their efforts trivialised. Indeed, the continuance of the phrase, still heard on Saturday mornings when little boys are playing football and so on, the phrase playing like girls in men's sport implies a long-held belief that women can't play games as they should be played. If women play sport well, and there are many who do, they're described as, and I quote, playing like blokes, or their sexuality is questioned, as is the case with boys who don't play sport. Many girls then, believing that they will be classified as tomboys or butch if they do participate, avoid serious involvement, particularly after the age of puberty. Well, I find this continuing mythology that sport is male gender proclaiming and the still entrenched discrimination incredible and disturbing, given the fact that over 50 years ago, women in South Australia successfully developed their own sporting associations to combat this social construction, and that the social construction that sport was a masculine activity and not appropriate for them. So rather than proselytise tonight about the inequity of sport in a country that proclaims itself to be the land of the fair go, I thought I might celebrate the efforts of some women in South Australia who, against the odds and public opinion, played the games they wanted to play, empowered other women to administer their own sporting organisations, and openly contested the view that sport was a manly activity. Perhaps at the end of this presentation I could come back to the view that sport is men's business and not very secret, and question why the efforts of a group of women in the period 1930 to 1960 seems in retrospect to have had a limited effect on community belief and practice. I would particularly like to acknowledge a woman journalist who many of you in fact would remember and would know, particularly if you're involved in schoolgirl sport, Lois Quarrell, who played a significant role in encouraging women in the period reviewed, that is between 1930 and 1960, to seek excellence in sport and manage their own affairs in the sporting domain, to defy the social construction of femininity. She was, in the language of sociology, a significant other, a facilitator who affected social change and influenced many women in terms of their involvement in and commitment to competitive sport. Lois Quarrell worked for The Advertiser and was one of the first women sports reporters in Australia. An accomplished sportswoman herself, when given the opportunity to write about women's sport, she went further than simply reporting and seized the chance to promote women's involvement, to raise issues of equity and generally to encourage wider participation and also ownership of sport. Organised sport for women in Australia really began in the 2 decades preceding Quarrell's appointment. There were reports in the press of women playing sport, for example cricket, in the 19th century, but it was usually recorded as an unusual event. Women's participation was on the whole casual and quite private. It was also limited because sport was classified as appropriate in the case of some activities like croquet, or improper in the case of others. Croquet was popular in England in the 1860s, and the first club to be established in Australia was one in Kapunda, South Australia, in 1868. The same lawn used for croquet could be used for tennis, So when that game became popular in the United Kingdom in the 1870s, South Australian women adopted it also. And this is a scene from, it's a North Adelaide tennis party, and if you look very carefully, in the bottom right-hand corner you'll see a box and a mallet, which indicates that they're also having an afternoon of croquet. So as I said, the area that could be used for croquet was also used for tennis. And we know that from looking at that particular slide, which is 1883, they were upper class women because they were wearing the fashionable tennis dress of the day. The girl on the right-hand side will illustrate that. You notice that she has an apron which seems to be turned up, and the apron turned up was part of the dress of women playing those days, so that they could put the balls in those pockets in that part that's been drawn up. But they're definitely upper class, North Adelaide. And those of you that drive down through Medindi, those big houses that face the parklands on the northern side of the city, you notice that as you drive down the large spaces that are between the houses, those spaces in fact first of all were croquet fields, and then they became tennis courts, and of late I suppose they're gardens or a place to park the 4 cars or whatever, but the space there in fact was space for sport. Maisie Parr was South Australia's first woman tennis champion, having won the state title in 1890. However, the numbers were small and the game confined to the genteel classes, who usually played on home courts in contrived social games. There are other sports, of course. This is one of them, cycling. Cycling came to Adelaide in the 1890s, and as soon as they changed it from being the cycle was changed from being a sporting implement, think of the penny farthing, with a gigantic wheel, hold the handle, run it along, put a foot on the step, leap, hope that you land on the seat, pedal like mad. A lot of the terms that we use, even in sport, like taking a header, come from those days of riding the penny farthings, but they were sporting implements. They weren't meant to ride from here to the railway station, whatever. And as soon as the safety bicycle came in and there was the drop frame, and of course as soon as women's costume changed so that women could ride bicycles, the bloomer fashion, the long pantaloons and so on, it meant that women in fact were mobile, and I guess because there wasn't a seat on the back for a chaperone, they became a bit more freer of those kind of constraints. Their dress changed, and many of you would know, from literally a circus tent to something which was called rational dress. They could in fact play sport and had the chance for more movement. So cycling, archery, but again archery was for the upper classes, played in private, tended to be played at St. Peter's College in the grounds. There were these kinds of games. Some girls learned to swim in the rivers, for example in the deep pools of the Torrens. I guess they weren't the upper class girls, or at the beach, but there were problems of modesty and propriety. Some girls joined the amateur swimming clubs along the Torrens. Here's a group of girls from 1925. These are the Gilby girls, the girls that came from the Gilberton Club. You can still see the gateway of the Gilberton swimming pool on the banks of the River Torrens. But these are the Gilby girls, 1925. And there is the old Gilberton Club where the river was dammed up. There was a swinging bridge on the right-hand side that went across the river, and many of them in fact learnt to swim there with their brothers. I include this one as well, another very famous Gilby girl, Gilberton girl, the first state representative. She represented South Australia in 1930. This is Laurel Shields. The South Australian Swimming Club was established by Cockney Tom Bastard, great name, but Cockney Tom Bastard in 1863, and races were conducted in the new city bars. He was the manager of the Adelaide City Bars. But races were held there, but only for boys. When Bastard's daughter Emma was appointed instructor for young ladies, an occasional race for girls was included, but there were very few entrants. Again, because of the morality of the costume and participating in swimming. The Amateur Swimming Association was formed in 1898, so at the turn of the century, but could attract few women, and as a consequence provided only odd events. The Advertiser on February the 27th, 1903, made much of, and I quote, a special race for women, one lap of the pool. But noted in a later report that the event, I quote again, attracted 3 little maidens of school-going age. One of these had to be rescued, and the other 2 struggled to complete the lap. The glamorous Annette Kellerman appeared at the city bars in Adelaide in January 1905, and her exploits, and I must admit also her costume, created great interest. and encouraged some women to join the amateur swimming clubs. But even by 1909, one of the strongest clubs, Semaphore, could only boast 20 ladies in a membership of 150. Mention was made of odd events at the swimming, getting in and having a splash, furthest dive, picking up pennies at the shallow end of the pool. These were all the events for girls. Swimming across the pool because they couldn't make it from one end to the other because they'd have to be safe, as mentioned before. The same occurred in athletics. Races for girls were usually of the novelty kind, egg and spoon race or the three-legged race. It might be thought that girls would not experience problems of acceptance in athletics like those in swimming, but even in this sport, girls had to wear long overcoats up until their, had to wear long overcoats up until their event and then shed them for their race and put them back on quickly afterwards. Apparently the bare legs of these fast women was considered quite provocative. This is South Australia's first state team, and you can see they're wearing overcoats. They're in their state uniforms, but right up until the time they're wearing long overcoats, and that's in Melbourne in 1933. Women had always ridden to the Adelaide Hunt, and the Adelaide Hunt is probably the oldest sporting club in South Australia, having been established around about 1840. But despite being sometimes better riders than their husbands or brothers, in fact they often were, they were expected to, and I quote, know their place and not appear at the front or to take difficult fences. And so even though they were better riders than their brothers, they in fact rode at the back of the hunt. This is a picture of, I thought you might be interested in two of the women. I could mention them all, but two of the women. The bottom left-hand corner is the quite well-known horsewoman Jo Hyson. She was the daughter of Hans Hyson and had an early death, but she was in fact a very great horsewoman and had a horse. She trained horses with her husband and in fact then had to hand these horses over that she could ride extremely well. She would have been fantastic in terms of riding them in the races, but had to hand them over to a male. In the bottom right-hand corner, this is, by the way, the Oakbank point-to-point in 1935, and again, a number of 6 or 8 outstanding women riders. But in the bottom right-hand corner is another outstanding sportswoman in South Australia, Mary Teasdale Smith, who was a great hockey player as well as a great horsewoman. By the turn of the century, women had added golf and hockey to their list of sports appropriate for women. In 1893, women were allowed to play at Royal Adelaide, and I quote, provided they played only in the mornings, but not on Saturdays, and allowed members, that is males, to play through if they were on the course. Again, the women players were of establishment families. The names were names like Ayres, Britton-Jones, Horn, Law-Smith, and so on. Florence Ayres, Flo Ayres, was the first lady club champion in 1906. Golf, by the way, was never questioned for women. It was viewed as a moderate activity, allowing people of similar class to mix. The action of the woman golfer was pacific and non-aggressive, thus complementing the cultural view of an appropriate sport to them. Besides, in their restrictive dress, they could not challenge the driving power of the men. However, limited membership as associates, and some of you who play golf would know that in fact lasted until quite recently, the limited membership as associates was to be the price they paid for acceptance until equal opportunity legislation in the 70s, the 1970s, not the 1870s, gave them the rights they should have had from the beginning. Hockey was introduced to Australia by the Waterhouse sisters on their return to Adelaide from Cheltenham Ladies College in England. And I love this photograph. The three Waterhouse girls are the three back row on the right. The guy is an umpire, one of the Horn brothers, and in fact there were, I think, 2 Horn girls in that picture as well. And the rather stunning little dark-haired girl in the front, second in the front is Lucy Ayres. So again, it was an upper-class establishment group, but the Waterhouse sisters, when they came back, introduced hockey to Adelaide and to Australia. They established the East Terrace hockey team, which is this in 1901, and played matches against others in the parklands. So there was a South Australian Ladies Hockey Association as early as 1905, and it was really very well organised. This was a sport introduced by women, for women, that men took up later, and as such it was deemed in the early days to be a women's sport, like netball. So that was acceptable for women to play hockey or netball. It was their sport, but all of the others belonged to men, invented by men, for men, was how it was thought. Indeed, the sport was considered a women's game like netball, which was introduced into South Australian schools at the turn of the century by physical education teachers who were trained in England. South Australian women had gone boating from the middle of the 19th century. Usually this meant sitting in a boat under a parasol with a hand languidly trailing in the water, watching a male demonstrate his skill with oars as part of the courting process. However, the River Torrens Boat Club had a splendid all-women's crew in the 1890s, and girls from Tormore House School, encouraged by their headmistress, Carolyn Jacob, were rowing in fours and eights on the river between 1900 and 1915. The University of Adelaide boasted 9 women's crews by the 1920s. This and the fact that South Australia dominated early interstate rowing contests would suggest an acceptance of the sport, but this was not so. There was constant questioning and criticism of their involvement and whether the sport was, again, I quote, an appropriate activity for women. Mention of Tormore House School prompts me to indicate the significance of the private girls' schools in Adelaide in encouraging and fostering sport for young women. The prestigious English schools, Rodean, Cheltenham, Waikamabi and Godolphin, all employed specialist teachers of physical education, and Australian schools followed suit. This is a group of, in fact this is the Methodist Ladies College, 1914, and there were a series of photographs in the paper describing the young Amazons of Adelaide, but they were again, I guess, an example of the girls' college teams, and they were very important and very prominent in the development of girls' sport in Adelaide. The argument in Britain within girls' private schools was that if games were valuable for boys, this is the rugby muscular Christianity tradition, you know, play a game and develop the character, all of that sort of thing. The girls' private school said, well, you know, if it developed those kinds of values in boys, why wouldn't games develop values in girls? Good argument, good question, or good statement to be made. The only issue, it seems, was what games and what values. For many a headmistress of the Adelaide colleges, there was the added dimension. Games could be used to dispel the view that girls were, at that time, physically delicate and not equal to boys. And so they're very prominent in getting girls into sporting teams and so on. And much of this good work was built on by Lars Quarrel, as I mentioned in a moment. In the absence of a training college in Australia for sports mistresses, PE teachers and so on, those young women who aspired to be PE games mistresses had little option but to go to the United Kingdom for their training, usually to Madame Osterberg's Physical Training College at Dartford, which specialised in Swedish gymnastics, or to Bedford College, which was very strong in games, particularly hockey and netball. Often these young women were employed on their return by their alma mater, being preferred by headmistresses who knew that they would affirm the school traditions when they came back. So they came back and went back to their old school. If the school could not find a staff member capable of teaching games, then they encouraged old scholars who excelled in sports to provide coaching assistance. Many women graduates of Adelaide University and those prominent in community sport responded. Wilderness, for example, was a tennis school, partly because it lacked the playing fields of other girls' colleges, but essentially because it could boast state tennis player Edna Collison as sports mistress. Methodist Ladies College had Sheila Morfitt, a state cricketer in charge of sport there, and so MLC became known for its cricketers. MLC also had the assistance of Mabel Cashmore, an international hockey player, to develop the sport. One of the best-known sportswomen of the period was Evelyn Taswell, also an international hockey player of some renown, like Cashmore. This lovely photograph of the South Australian hockey team in 1928 includes this wonderful group of women coming off the sports field with, talk about that statement that's often made, joy in the effort. I mean, it's a joyous group. It's been fun. Evelyn Taswell, Taz as she was known, is the woman, the tall woman in the centre. In fact, she was captain of the state team. An outstanding Australian hockey player who played for, I think, over 20 years in the Australian hockey team. And on my side of Taz is Mabel Cashmore. They were strong friends, played in the state team. But those two people had a tremendous influence on the development of women's sport in South Australia. Taz, as she was affectionately known, played in and captained the state women's hockey team from 1920 to 1936. Think about that, 16 years of playing in the state hockey team. She played in the first Australian touring side ever and was a regular in the national team from about 1925. Teaming with sports mistress Grace Manson, she made Woodlands a hockey school and the team to beat. But when she was there, they seldom were. Lois Quarrel, aged 21, sort of trying to develop in you a picture of these young women who were full of enthusiasm and exuberance and didn't want any of this nonsense of not being able to play games. Lars Quarrel, aged 21, when appointed to the Advertiser, recognised the value of these women, endorsed and publicised their efforts, both as individual players and also with their school teams, encouraging them to take the most talented girls with them into community teams. Indeed, Arawa Hockey Club became in effect the Woodlands Old Scholars team, centred around Evelyn Taswell, and Greenwood Club, with Mabel Cashmore as captain, the natural destination of MLC graduates. Given her age and sporting talents, Quarrel, she was a swimmer, netball player, an athlete, very good golfer, and her link with the newspaper, Quarrel mixed easily and often with these women. She attended all their sporting contests and knew them personally. She asked them to do more, to encourage others outside the private school system to play in community teams organised interstate sporting associations conducted by women. In this she sought help from another institution, and this was the Y. Anne Stanton, Secretary of the YWCA in Adelaide and a prominent state cricketer, and this is a YWCA cricket team, was another valued ally. She established training days for the sports that were popular, hockey, netball, cricket, tennis and athletics, and encouraged ordinary girls, those not from the private schools, to learn the skills and then join or form a club in their district. Her successor at the Y, Rose Winter, was an accomplished swimmer and organised what she termed splash days each Monday evening at the Unley Pool to teach young women, again who are not at the private schools, to swim. In the photograph there, as I said, that's a Y team. It's the first YWCA team, a cricket team in the 1930s. In the back, the rather glum-looking girl in the second from the left, not the back row, there's a back row, isn't there, but in the middle row was Sue Summers, who was an outstanding cricketer, coached by Anne Stanton, who was a state cricketer herself and the secretary of the YWCA. She in fact made the Australian women's cricket team. And it's interesting going through the records of the publications of Quarrel in the newspapers. She got Sue Summers to send her back reports about being on the boats and going to England, and the fact they had to be in bed by 10 o'clock and they were to be seen with men on the boat and all of those sorts of things. But Quarrel wrote all of this up almost like a diary, but certainly wrote up all the cricket matches in England and how well Sue Summers from South Australia in fact did in terms of performing. Electric light cricket, a South Australian invention, many of you would know, in 1930, invented by servicemen, but an invention in 1930 here in Adelaide made it possible for shop girls to play sport outside of working hours. And you might be thinking, well, after hours at night, the 1930s, you're quite right. It was contentious that women should play games at night on morality grounds and safety issues, but Quarrel defended their right to do so and encouraged them to form shop teams and so on. The influence of Quarrel could be recognised in many of the initiatives to widen participation of women in sport in South Australia. She courted the friendship of elite women performers, people like Taswell and Cashmore in hockey, Joan Martin, Sue Summers, Anne Stanton and Dot Lawton in cricket. And I put this one in because it's a little later than the period I'm talking about. It's the South Australian cricket team in 1951, but the third person from the right is Dot Lawton, who was an outstanding cricket player and hockey player in South Australia, playing in the 30s and still playing by then in the 1950s. And again, some quite outstanding women players in that team. Marge Adams, second from the left, Ruth Dow, third from the left, June Ingham, I think it's in the centre, the captain of the team, and Ray Miller at the back in the dress, who was the manager of the South Australian team and also became manager of the Australian women's team. But Dot Lawton, still playing in the 50s, started in the 30s, brilliant cricketer and brilliant hockey player. And many of the women, when I did this little study, I kept coming across these women who in fact not only played a particular sport and played it well, but played several. And they were the days, of course, when you had very distinct seasons, and you had a winter sport and a summer sport. And many of these women, their names kept cropping up. They're obviously outstanding sportswomen. Lars Quarrel recognised them and then used them to her advantage and the advantage of developing women's sport in South Australia. Gwen Rankin and Lorna Hill in netball, Del Hill in rowing. Gwen Rankin is the captain of the state women's netball team there, 1936. That's Gwen Rankin in the front of that particular group. And again, all of those girls can be identified. Wonderful photograph. Look of joy about being involved in the whole thing. When women's athletics was in trouble, as I said, she used these women to advantage. When athletics was in trouble and in danger of being resumed as an associate minor affiliate of men's athletics, rower Del Hill, who was quite famous in the state as a rower, as an international rower, at the prompting of Quarrel, provided the leadership for the group to continue as a women's association. Quarrel went further than local encouragement and endorsement. She wrote about women's sporting deeds outside Australia and about issues of equity being fought elsewhere. There was a tendency in the media to trivialise women's sport in Australia, to suggest that any incursion into what was deemed manly activity was to be considered unusual, inappropriate or amusing. Usually all of those things. Quarrel wrote about other places, other ways. She usually concluded her articles, why not here in South Australia? In 1936, when the Olympics were to be held in Berlin, the Australian team travelled to Germany on the ocean liner Mongolia, which berthed in Adelaide at Outer Harbour on May the 21st, 1936. The women swimmers trained at the Henley Pool and the athletes at the University Oval in Adelaide. Quarrel interviewed them all and suggested them as suitable role models for South Australian sportswomen. When the Empire Games were held in Sydney 2 years later, the oarmen carrying the British team stopped in Adelaide, and they also trained in the city, Quarrel describing the women athletes and their commitment to sport. In the Games, 30 Australian women competed and 14 of them were medalists. Their success and consequent publicity did much to popularise sport for women as a worthwhile and appropriate activity. And in fact, I picked up, this is a quote from the Advertiser in 1936 that suggests this enormous development that occurred in the 1930s, again with Quarrel writing the script. But interesting, sports hitherto sacred to men have been explored, whatever that means, and the public, I know what it means and you do too, and the public, far from being mildly amused, is today impressed by the high standard of play attained. And that was, she would not put up with any nonsense, Lois. She was a terrific writer in terms of women's rights, and those of you that have ever looked at those newspapers of the 30s and 40s would be amazed at the amount of space and photographs that were devoted to women's sports. It was really quite outstanding. However, Quarrel had to combat entrenched attitudes about competitive sport for women. When the Interstate Women's Cricket Carnival was held in Adelaide for the first time in late 1938, the Lord Mayor at the civic reception for players welcomed them, but urged them, I quote, not to be too competitive. Quarrel ignored his speech entirely and described the exploits of the women in terms normally reserved for men's sport. She used words like, the batting was forceful, the bowling was fast and accurate. Well-selected photos illustrated the skill of the visiting women, not their gentility. They were cricketers who happened to be women. By the end of the 30s, women were playing sport in increasing numbers in South Australia, and their choice of activity had widened. 80 women were playing badminton in regular competitions. There were 200 women table tennis players in 30 teams. Quarrel wrote that, and I quote, hundreds of Adelaide women were playing golf each week. Kath Raymer was the state champion and playing kuyonga for the handicap of 3. Women played polo for the first time in 1939 and drew many of their riders from the Adelaide Hunt, where the numbers of women were increasing rapidly. The most popular sports for women were still hockey, netball, cricket, tennis, and there was comment in the press about the need for more facilities to cater for their numbers, and in some cases, a need for facilities full stop, because they in fact turned up, played their game and went home, but didn't change the ground. During the war years, women replaced men, as you know, in the factories and on the land. Sporting contests were considered frivolous and unpatriotic with the men away. However, women maintained some sports in trust, enjoyed and were empowered by the experience, and continued their active, less subservient role at war's end, much to the chagrin of men who came back and expected them to step back and to the side. The pack of the Adelaide Hunt, shouldn't call them dogs, the pack of the Adelaide Hunt, indeed the existence of the oldest sporting club in the state depended on women members. Life-saving clubs had restricted women's involvement in the 30s to ceremonial events before the war. While the men were in the forces and away at the front, women undertook all tasks of sea rescue. Women took on roles that were unavailable to them before, and their success encouraged them in the years following the cessation of war. The National Fitness Council, the NFC, was established at the end of the 30s and promoted activity sport programs for women. For health reasons, Helen Black, a New Zealand phys ed teacher, was appointed to the National Fitness Council in South Australia, and Quarrel added her to her list of facilitators. Her group as she described them. When the war was over, sporting competition resumed in earnest and participation figures rapidly escalated. The late 40s and early 50s saw the emergence of some wonderful women athletes in South Australia, and Lars Quarrel publicised their success. Swimmer Denise Norton was South Australia's first woman Olympian. Athlete Anne Shanley had been here. She is competing, not winning, but many of you would, or some of you in fact, would recognise that Strickland winning the race at the Empire Games in Sydney in 1950. But Anne Shanley, and now Anne Cooper, is the girl in white with the Australian symbol on her vest, the semi-final, and Anne Shanley is a South Australian girl. I'll give you an example of the sort of up and go of Lars Quarrel. Just after this particular period of time, a very famous woman athlete who was written up throughout the world as being a great woman athlete, married, not sure whether she had children, I don't think she did have children at that stage, but Fanny Blankers-Cohen, a Dutch woman, came out to Australia. And it was suggested that she should run in Adelaide. The Men's Association, Amateur Athletic Association, couldn't find the money. She was a woman athlete, couldn't find the money, couldn't bring her here. She was a professional athlete and demanded funds to get her and her husband here. But Lars Quarrel, in fact, took up the cudgels and dismissed the men in the newspaper and organised a committee herself, raised the money, and in fact brought Fanny Blankers-Cohen to race at the Wavell Showgrounds in Adelaide, and Anne Shanley did very well against her. Thanks, Judy. And in fact, here's a signed photograph of Fanny Blankers-Cohen doing a demonstration over hurdles under lights at night at the Wavell Showgrounds. But there were some outstanding women, I mentioned a couple of them. International cricketer Ruth Dow, hockey internationals Pat Haig and Pam Gregory and Margaret Wallach, all in the Australian team. Faye Dumont and Helen Strange were regulars in the Australian netball team. And Joy Twining, who had also been a netball international, began her long and successful career in badminton in 1953. And that's the South Australian badminton team, but you notice the girl in front with an Australian blazer is the very famous and outstanding athlete Joy Twining. The influx of European migrants to Australia after the war brought women with different sporting interests to the usual Anglo sports, the sports like netball and hockey and so on. But even in the traditional sports there were some valuable additions. The Zevenboom twins, Gerda and Jani, and Henny de Vries were Dutch swimmers who came out to Adelaide. Anna Boxen was a Polish javelin thrower who came to Adelaide, now Anna Pazira, and living here with her kids, quite good swimmers in Adelaide. Vera Hody was a Hungarian sprinter, and Aldona Snarskite, a Lithuanian table tennis player. Basketballers from the Baltic countries really created that sport in Adelaide. But probably the two most influential women to act as role models for South Australian women were two other imports, Marjorie Jackson and Dawn Fraser, but of course they were Australians. Jackson, the so-called Lithgow Flash, came to Adelaide after gold medal success in the 1952 Helsinki Olympic Games and after marriage to local cyclist Peter Nelson. And of course she's still on the sporting scene, involved with SOCOG and so on. The thing about these two, the two I'm talking about, is that Jackson retired after the Olympic Games and in the papers in many ways let Lars Quarrel down, because all of the statements in the Women's Weekly at the time and in the advertising were her about having a real career, having played as a child and in fact settling down to married life and having children and so on. It's not really what Lois wanted her to say. But the other girl who came was of course Dawn Fraser. Fraser came to Adelaide in 1955 when her coach Harry Gallagher took on management of the City Bars in Adelaide. Dawn was preparing for the 1956 Olympic Games in Melbourne. Both athletes, Jackson and Fraser, were photographed training, and Fraser in particular destroyed the myth that women had to make a choice between being an elite athlete and being feminine. A photograph of Fraser training with weights at the Adelaide pool did, I think, a great deal to move the debate on women and sport beyond the appropriate, inappropriate discussion. I mean, for somebody to be lifting weights like that. The Games in Melbourne that Dawn swam at were a great success, and the nation's athletes did better than expected, none more so than the women. People like Fraser, Betty Cuthbert, Shirley Strickland, even the South Australian athlete Norma Thrower won a medal, a bronze in the hurdles. Shirley Strickland, of course, the gold medalist. And that's the South Australian team, South Australian cricket team in 1957. included 3 people who are in the national team, in the Australian team. Barbara Orchard, centre back row, Marge Adam, third from the left, and Ruth Dow, the famous Ruth Dow, the cricketer, third from the right in that particular photograph. Quarrell continued to write the women's sports section of the Advertiser until her retirement in 1970. She noted then that women had access to a wide range of activities, that the numbers of participants had increased dramatically since the war, that they had, to quote her, ownership of their own associations, that they were accepted as athletes and women. The question I'd ask is, were they and are they? Well, let me conclude. Only women playing sport in Australia and South Australia is now accepted. Athletes like Kathy Freeman and Susie O'Neill are household names and highly regarded. Because of their success, they are given, I think, honorary bloke status, but because they're nice and not too aggressive. So I picked the athlete out deliberately. I didn't pick out Lucy Sharman Taylor, the cyclist. I picked out, and I thought the photograph, that this is the construction of somebody who picks the right photograph because it fits in with what they want. Sort of thwarts the idea. But this lovely photograph of Kathy. So I said they're given honorary bloke status, but because they're good in their sport, but because they're nice and not too aggressive outside the arena, they still exemplify the feminine image. Occasionally there are concerns about the type of sport played by women, for example, powerlifting and football, or in this case, this is this is Beth Francis, an Australian, Victorian woman, who in fact is a bodybuilder. Now there are still some doubts about some of these activities, so when I said before in the 30s about appropriate, inappropriate, those kind of things, that still exist, and sometimes with good reason. But you might want to debate that too. But usually, and I hope you'll agree with my argument, but usually if they play or perform well, they're given honorary bloke status, they've got to win girl, that's what it's about. But usually if they play or perform well and they look good doing it, then there are no problems. You've only got to listen to Ken Cunningham talking about women in sport. If women play in short skirts and play golf, that's fine. But when little girls ring up and say they're involved in judo, he has some doubts about those kinds of things. It's the only time I feel terribly angry listening to the radio. I feel like to stop and get to a phone and ring the so-called KG, because there is still that, I'm saying there is still that attitude that there are certain sports for women and other sports that they shouldn't contest. So as I said, if they play or perform well and look good doing it, then there are no problems. Looking good still means looking feminine and attractive, and I have to say, and you'd be aware of this, some women accommodate this by wearing makeup and jewellery to define their gender. Lisa Ondieki, for example, is a classic. My coach Lisa is a little girl here in Adelaide. Is a classic example of using jewellery and makeup when she runs the marathon. And I'd have to say to you, and again, you might want to take me up on this, but I have to say to you, I admit to some concern about the fact that some elite performers, women, still believe that they have to resort to Playboy-type images to sell themselves as athletes to secure sponsorship. Now, this is an illustration from the so-called Golden Girls calendar, which came out produced by Jane Fleming and included Tanya Van Heer. And as I said, I don't think that does anything for the image of women's sport. It's the kind of sexual, come-on kind of look, whereas I think all of the photographs ought to be, I think, can be as pleasing if they're athletic and in costume and so on. I won't go into that. I'll just simply say to you, I have some concern with that. And I'm trying to bring it up to date and say, hey, it was terrific in the 30s and 40s and 50s, but when Quarrell retired, she thought women have made it. Perhaps now the discrimination, though, is more subtle, less overt. But let me remind you of the media research I spoke of earlier. When I first started talking to you, I gave you figures from 1996. Not 1936, 1996. With a very small percentage of space in the newspapers and so on. Sportswomen still get very little TV coverage except during major world events like the Olympics or in Australia the Commonwealth Games. And remember again, thinking in terms of Tanya, doing so very well in the Commonwealth Games a year ago and then coming back and then in many ways I guess being lost. Not her as much because she has been well promoted. Women's sports stories are still located, I think, in the peripheral areas of the sports pages. The inner pages, they get less space, lower columns. Margaret Pewtress was the president of Women's Sport Australia and made this comment, and it was made certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, but I've forgotten the exact date. But I think the end bit is right. I think she's got it right when she says the real point is to ensure that women playing sport is accepted as the norm. You know, you don't have to make some comment about who they are and where their families are and whether they've got kids and those sorts of things. And isn't it amazing they're playing sport and so on? Sport, in fact, shouldn't define gender. That's really what I'm saying. I'm saying sport, in fact, is an activity. It doesn't define gender. People want it to define gender, but she's saying it should be accepted as the norm, an integral part of Australia's mainstream sports culture. Why do women then get less room, less space, and so on? Why does she need to make that kind of comment? Well, I think sport still defines gender, male gender. Collins had a great quote, Terry Collins, sport carries the colours of men's egos. He's an Australian, and an American sociologist, Donald Rozek, argued that women's involvement in sport somehow, I love this phrase and that's why I've used it, somehow it smudges the identifying line between the sexes. Well, the blokes think it does. I mean, if in fact sport makes a man of you, you've got to exclude the women, and it still continues. It violates the strongly held belief, I think, that sport really is men's business. A male-making activity, an initiation for boys entering men's groups, and hey, you know, regardless of whether you like it or not, little boys, you have to play sport. Kick footy end-to-end with dad, and so on. You know, the kind of theory, you know, dad comes home and sees little boy playing with dollies because it's sort of an asexual activity, and so on, says to his wife, oh, so what's happening to my son? You know, or take the teddy, tear the teddy out of the little boy's hands and rough in a gun or a footy or, you know, something aggressive and so on. But I'm saying sport really is men's business, unfortunately, a male-making activity, an initiation for boys entering men's groups, invented by men for men. And that's part of the hang-up. A few years ago, if you don't believe me, when the Australian women's cricket team played a test against England in Adelaide, they were denied the use of the Adelaide Oval. The ground was being used by the state men's second 11, a men's lesser team. Instead, the women played their game, their test cricket, at St Peter's College. Coral, I think, would have turned in a grave. There is, I think, no denying the fact that in Australia, sport is still a man's game. But then, what do you think? Thank you. Do you want to borrow mine? Are there any questions? Please, Pat. As far as I know, no. I think a lot of the earlier curricula, particularly in the girls' private schools in Adelaide, it was written in as part of the curriculum. Again, it followed the traditional English pattern. I mean, that's the record I have of it, that in fact it was accepted. There probably were, I guess, but I think in some schools I've actually read that if parents didn't want their girls to play sport, it was suggested that they go to another school. Some headmistresses in Adelaide were very, very strong feminists in terms of, I think, wanting girls to play sports and to get rid of the delicate kind of image of sports being fragile and gentle. They wanted them to be, you know, to have lots of nice qualities, but in fact to play sport and games because it was nonsense to think that sport and games belonged to boys.
When was it first possible for women to train as phys ed teachers in Australia without having to go to England?
Good question, because I think when I mentioned, I was thinking actually as I was saying it, most women in Adelaide that I know of in that period of the 30s went to places like, I mentioned Dartford and Bedford and those sort of places, but in fact there was a physical education college in Sydney. I think it was called the Australian Fencing. It started as a fencing club, but they trained women phys ed teachers there. And there were a few women who were trained in, it's now the Australian, still in existence, the Australian College of Physical Education, a private college. The only one I think that is a private college. It's now been attached to a university. I think it might be attached to Sydney University, but and that only happened a few years ago. But I think it's the only private college of that kind, and that would have been in the 30s. So it was possible. And then I think the phys ed courses at Adelaide University. I mean, I trained at Adelaide University, and I trained there in the 50s, and certainly there have been groups that have gone through before me. A lot of women, I guess, in the 40s. I can't remember the exact date, but
a woman came out from Bedford, Betty Barwell came out to help establish the physical education school at Adelaide University with Bert Apps. He came over from Melbourne, became director of the National Fitness Council, so he came over in the early 40s, at the end of the war, and then established the physical education diploma at Adelaide University, and that's when, so it would have been, I can't give you the exact date, it would have been in the mid-40s when it was established, before the end of the war. Okay, there it is. Thank you for that.
Yes, you convinced us that there should be greater coverage for women's sports in the media. We're convinced, but how are you going to convince Murdoch and Packer?
Well, I wish I knew, because you're right. I mean, it's easy to say these kind of things. People have this attitude that an audience don't want to watch women playing sport. Now, I find that nonsense. But for 20 years, I travelled away with the Australian track and field team, and in preparation for the Olympics, we would go to Europe and compete in Grand Prix meets. And these would be meets in places like Paris and Oslo and London and so on. And I'd have a full team of men and women to get the men in the Grand Prix meets, but very few women. And whenever I argued about it and said, look, we've got some really outstanding women competitors, they'd say, well, use the crude expression, they don't put bums on seats, nobody's interested in them. Now, we have great javelin throwers. We've got 2 great women javelin throwers at the moment. And my guess is even now, when they go to Europe, they might be able to get one of those girls into a meet. And the usual thing happens is that there's a javelin throw for men, 12 competitors, javelin throw for women, 3. Why? Because they want to get it over with quickly, and they put it on first. And it's awful. It still exists. And I guess in answer to your question, the newspapers would say, again, I'm not sure it's right, but the theory is, when they're designing a newspaper, they say, well, who are you designing it for? And they say, well, the man buys the newspaper. I don't think this is really true, but I've seen the descriptions. And in terms of sociology and so on, they say the men buy the newspapers, and what they do is they read the front of the page to see if the country's at war, and turn to the back and read about the pros and read in to the sports pages, and then go back to the front again and read the rest of the news. And it's really designed for a male readership, not for a female readership. And again, TV, as I said, that cartoon of Schultz, my wife is a great sportswoman, and on the weekends we'll be watching sport, and I'll say, let's have the sports roundup. And they talk about all men's sport. And I wait for it now because I know it's going to come. And then there's sort of a voice in the background says, okay, where were the women's sport? They were playing this weekend. And she's quite right, it's not reported. Because the view is, it's for men. Men watch sports programs. No, it's not true. They have. It's part of that conditioning process. No. I mean, the matches last night at Roland Garros Stadium, if any of you had a look at that, I mean, fantastic, the women's semi-final. Yes, that's true. But would you recall the pages of Lois Quarrel in, say, the 40s? I mean, double-page spreads, wonderful photographs. Well, I defend some of the men are good organisers too, but actually, I didn't pick it. I mean, there's so much to it. I've just taken a selection, but the influence of the women's sport at the university. Yes, they were. But I think also the graduates of the University of Adelaide. There were some outstanding women who, in fact, organised, swam for Adelaide University or competed in athletics for Adelaide University.
John, who was actually the editor of the Advertiser in that time? Because, she was the lowly sports reporter after all said and done, so there must have been an editorial position which allowed her to do what she did.
Yes, I've wondered about that. I mean, obviously it was a male editor. And I guess it has more to do, I think, it has more to do because I interviewed Lois before she died. And she was feisty. I mean, she went in and demanded. And as many, if there are women here who can remember her, who were involved in sport, will remember she always turned up at sporting contests. And she was just as likely to get people to ring and to write and get men, put men in important positions to ring in and almost make it. She really, in a way, created a demand for it herself. I mean, she was an extraordinary woman. And she, just of late, has been recognised, I think, by a number of sporting associations by being made a life member. I didn't recognise her, in her lifetime, but I suddenly realised that her name has popped up time and time and time and time again. But no, that's worth following up. I should follow that up.
Haven't we got a bit of a chicken and egg problem here? That whilst the
if we
culture
haven't,
is,
you're creative.
But whilst the culture's like it is, there's a sense in which that creates the demand that sort of causes the problem to be perpetuated.
Yes.
How do you get out of that vicious circle?
Well, I mean, you're asking me questions that you know I don't know the answer to. And you're right. I mean, it does create that kind of cycle. It becomes the expectation. And as soon as you make the changes, hey, where's the sport gone that we read? You know, the men in fact do that. It is difficult. But sorry, female editor. That's part of it. There is enormous pressure though coming from Canberra in terms. Some of it good and some of it has been, I think, damaging. For example, Lois Quarrell encouraged women to form their own associations. During the war, she formed the South Australian Women's Swimming Association. It lasted from about 1944 to 44, the early 40s to 1948. And then the men put a lot of pressure on and that sort of thing, and it was lost. But I was saying about the government. The government now funds sport. In the old days, it was a matter of people going along. It was amateur sport. You played where you could play. There wasn't very much money involved and so on. But the Australian Sports Commission fund organisations. And they found that with, say, something like 120 sports, and there were women's sports as well, you multiply that, it's 240 plus other organisations and so on. They made a decision, and I think it was wrong, they made a decision that men's and women's sporting associations should combine and form one association. Now, a lot of women fought against that because the women who were in positions of power in the administration at the time were really quite strong individuals who had an identity in their own right. But they gave in. A lot of them gave in. I can remember being involved. I was actually they asked me to be the chairperson of getting the Men's Athletic Association and the Women's Athletic Association together. I can tell you, the men were appalling. And at one stage, I simply said to them, look, you talk among yourselves for a while, I'm just going outside. I'll come back and we'll see consult from there, but talk some sense. Now, when that happened, when they did combine, you probably guess what happened. The powerful, very effective women, some outstanding women, Wendy I was one of them, President of the Women's Athletic Association and so on. All the positions were voted in by this large group, mainly men. Men were placed in the positions of responsibility, and I think a lot of women lost the possibility of that administrative leadership role that they had in sport that in fact Lois Quarrell had worked so hard for. It was lost really in the, I guess, the late 80s. And now you'll find there are a few sports that are still women's sports with their own administrators, but a lot of sports like athletics and swimming and so on are now the Swimming Association or the Athletic Association, and with not as many women in those positions. So that's been part of the problem. But I guess the advantage of the Sports Commission is it has a section on women's sport, and you better be very careful about discrimination in terms of women's sport now. And they've been working, they've got a very good team in Canberra working on raising the awareness of young girls and so on about, the possibilities of playing sport, not having any of these hang-ups about sport being an activity for boys. So, in answer to your question, I don't know.
Can you...
Well, I think some people, some women in particular do want to be seen. They don't want to see the two words female and athlete being an oxymoron. They want to just... Well, it's true, but there are also some great women, female athletes, elite athletes, who in fact want to be considered to be athletes in their own right, who happen to be women.
John, you spoke of the need for pressure groups and lobbying with the media. I do recall back in the late 1940s, the Vintage Car Club were talking about publicity there, and somebody who was a cub reporter, it might have been Tony Lucas, spoke of the South Australian women's hockey team landing in at the Advertiser en masse with carrying their sticks when publicity had cut back. The way he described it sounded like a bloodbath, but they certainly got themselves reinstated with full coverage. And this is one of the ways to go.
I think that's the situation you're talking about. I think in fact was organised by Quarrell. I mean, but not, she wouldn't admit to it, but in fact would say to them, if you want, if you want to, well, why not talk to the editor? And so you're right.
John, you might enjoy the story of how the ABC National Advisory Council tried to persuade the executive producer of TV Sport to cover more women's sport, and this was probably about 1990. And we got him in and said, now come on, what about the coverage of women's netball? And he said, people wouldn't be interested in it. And we said, but look, more people play women's netball in Australia than almost any other sport. Oh, no, he said, no, we couldn't do it. He said, and anyway, it wouldn't be really interesting and it'd be too hard to film because the ball goes out of court too often. Is that true? He really got howled down, I must say.
Yes. I mean, you've almost got no hope, have you, with somebody making a statement like that? They can probably be rational and everything else, but in terms of those kind of statements, you're right. Why should they? We don't ask, for example, we don't ask boys to compete against men. We don't say of little boys with junior teams, they can't compete at the level of men. Why should they compete or be reported? I think women compete as women athletes in an environment of women, and men the same. I don't think you're right. I think that argument is used by so many that that women somehow have to be the equal of men and compete with men to be allowed to play. They don't want to play with men, and I think it's I guess I mean the women throw a lighter javelin, the men throw a longer one. It's interesting that with javelin, they invented a new way of throwing the javelin. That was a rotational turn, and they found that the men could throw the javelin outside the arena with a turn. So they had to come up with an idea of either lengthening arena, changing them, that sort of thing. But what they did was did not allow. They wrote into the rules that there would be no rotation when throwing a javelin. I think they can come up with any kind of rules that they want, and I think the idea that men and women have to compete and a man can throw further. I think women throwing against one another, I mean, you can always recognise a good throw, and the men and the women don't throw together. I agree with you that if in fact a woman was throwing 60 metres and a man was throwing 80 metres, well then it would be, and they're competing together, it would be noticeable. But I don't think, there's never been an argument on the part of the women. You wouldn't get an argument from me that men and women should compete somehow together. We always get these kind of things, don't we, in terms of tennis, that the best bloke can beat the best woman. Who cares? I mean, they don't play together, and there's no point to it. But I can get enormous pleasure out of watching, like last night, Hingis play against Sanchez, and it's good tennis. They just happen to be women. And I think that's what futurists were saying. We've got to get to the stage where we don't have these hang-ups, but we still use the language. I've been out on Saturday mornings and heard, sports coaches saying to little boys, you're playing like a group of girls. Now, if that means playing like the Opals, for example, well, they must be playing very well. But that's not what he means. He really means girls can't play sport. And people like that really ought to be stopped from making those kind of statements, because what they do is they perpetuate with little boys this kind of thing that sport is to them, and girls, in fact, their efforts should be trivial. Okay, I think that's
one question. I wonder if you could tell me what you think about the future of mixed sport. I know, for example, one school where boys and girls are playing soccer together, and that is actually a very useful thing, because the presence of the girls actually makes the boys a bit more careful, and the whole thing doesn't become so aggressive. And different set of skills are actually evolved, and different sort of appreciation of one another is evolved. Tennis, all sorts of bowls, I suppose. The sexes do play together. And I can think of, say, perhaps not rugby, but possibly hockey, things like that. If there were mixed sports, it would be a different sort of attitude, wouldn't it? And the abilities of either side would actually be combined rather than pitted against one another or seen as separately. I can see that it's good for men to play theirs and women to play theirs, but to combine the two might be useful. Would you like to comment on that?
They've in fact in an effort to overcome what's been occurring in schools, boys playing sport, boys dominating playing spaces and not allowing girls on those particular playing spaces. But in fact what they would do would be to combine. And they found that, I think all of the researchers suggested that where they thought you would have the best possible result, it's been good for the girls who have been good at sport. It hasn't been good for the girls who have low self-esteem, particularly at the age of puberty and so on. They've in fact not wanted to play, and so on, and so I think they've abandoned those. I think you're right. I think with adults who can appreciate the sharing of those kinds of values and so on. I think in recreational pursuits there are so many where you can combine. I think you're spot on. I think that would be right. But I think I personally would prefer elite women athletes to compete as elite women athletes in their own domain, and men to do the same. I tend to be a great fan of excellence in sport. I mean, that's my background. I think I think, unfortunately, what we do when we talk about sport, I say this to phys ed students at the university, in most other aspects of our life, we seem to have very precise definitions and words. But in the domain of sport, we use the one word, sport, for everything. And sport comes from the word to sportare, to, like you say, play and enjoy and amuse and so on. It's a very different activity from athletics, from contesting for a prize. And I guess what I'm saying is the ideal place to try that would be in schools. They are trying it. There are some problems with it, particularly with girls with a lower self-esteem about games in the presence of boys. I know there are a number of women phys ed teachers who would like to abandon that and said it has not worked. Others who in fact say it has been of benefit, particularly the girls who do like playing sport. They play at a much higher standard, and the boys do tone down their behaviour somewhat. And let's face it, if we can develop a civilised kind of behaviour in all aspects of life, there's a lot to be said for that. So something to be said for, something to be said against. But I think at the moment, I have to say the jury is out on that. It's a good question. It certainly has come up with women and men phys ed teachers talking about how to overcome that entrenched attitude. So, yes.
Well, thank you. We'll leave any further discussion to over supper. I'll call on a council member, John Healy, who's also a newsletter editor, to come forward and to move a vote of thanks to Dr. Daly.
I'd like to thank John Daly on behalf of everybody for what's been, I think, a very informative and obviously thought-provoking talk, judging by the number of questions and also the points of view that have been expressed. I think it's very easy to forget when we see all our Australian sportswomen shining at the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. It's very easy to forget that they wouldn't be where they were or where they are today if it hadn't been for a very considerable and determined effort on the part of a large number of women for several decades. And I think it's brought home to us the fact that these changes don't just happen of their own accord. They do have to be pushed for, and they do have to be fought for if we're going to even get as far as we have by this stage at the end of the century. I know I was being continually surprised when John was talking, on the one hand, by how progressive some of these organisations were for their time in the 30s and 40s, and how determined the women were. And on the other hand, surprised at just how massive the resistance to change was in all sorts of fundamental ways and in very petty ways. I mean, you can't really expect to think that people are taking you seriously at playing sport if you're not even given a change room to use while you're at the Oval. And also the photos I thought were very entertaining, just to show how completely different the situation of women playing sport was in those days, where they played and when they played and the terms on which they were allowed to play. So it's been a very informative and entertaining talk, and I'd like to thank John Daly and ask you to show your appreciation to him.